I'd like to call your attention to the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus chapter 1. We just finished a 6-week series on the life of Joseph. If you happen to miss one of the sermons, the reason I have my little phone up here is because I am actually recording each sermon. I have been for a while, and there is a page on YouTube for United Baptist Church in Danville, Virginia. So if you have missed one of the sermons, or you want to hear another sermon, or you want to share it with someone, all of the sermons on Sunday morning are on our YouTube page. And we began today a 6-week study in the book of Exodus. The story is told about a marketplace in northern India. People would bring their wares to trade and to sell them. And one old farmer had several, about 9 or 10 quail that he had caught. And he wanted to sell them. He brought them week after week, and nobody seemed to be interested. Finally, he got an idea. He decided that what he was going to do was he was going to tie them together by their little legs, and he was going to make them and teach them to walk in a circle. So this happened, and he kept bringing the little birds week after week. He had taught them to walk in a circle, but nobody cared. Nobody wanted them. Then one day, finally, a devout member of the Hindu religion came by. This was a holy Hindu man, and he believed in the idea that Hindus have that they respect all life. His heart went out to these little birds. He bought them all. He said to the farmer, "Okay, I've just paid you for them. Now set them free." Farmer said, "Okay, you paid for them." So he took off the rope from their little legs. And to the amazement of the Hindu, these little birds continued to walk in a little circle. The Hindu was like, "You're free now. You're free. Go, go." He shooed them even. They landed a short distance away and resumed walking around in circles again. Free from their bonds, they just kept going around in circles as if they were still tied. That's what we see in the book of Exodus. When we come to the second book of the Bible, we all know it's Exodus, but what does the word Exodus actually mean? The word Exodus means to leave. The book of the Exodus is Israel leaving Egypt. But they didn't just leave. They were brought out by the mighty and the powerful hand of God. And God never wanted the Israelites to forget just how He had rescued them. One phrase we see over and over in the book of Exodus, and really over and over in the Old Testament, is this phrase, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt." We see it in Leviticus 26:13. We see in Exodus 13:3, "I want you to commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of the slavery, because the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand." Exodus 22, right as God has given the Israelites the 10 Commandments, this is what He says. "I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." In Leviticus 19:36, when God commanded Israel to be honest, He said, "Use honest scales and honest weights. use an honest hint. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. 40 years later, Joshua declares that he's going to follow God, that his household is going to be a godly household. And you know the words he used, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Earlier in that speech, though, Joshua 24:17, he declared, it was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery. Over and over again, God says to the Israelites, you were enslaved. You were in Egypt. Egypt had you. Egypt had captivated you. They had made you slaves, but I have brought you out. And really what God is saying is, stop acting like you're still enslaved. He wants more than anything in this book of Exodus. He's already gotten the Israelites out of Egypt. And now what he's trying to do is get Egypt out of the Israelites. Because he sees, just like those little birds that farmer had, he sees that he has released Israel from the chain of Egyptian bondage. But they're still acting like they've been enslaved. Well, how did the Israelites become enslaved? And why did the Israelites become enslaved? That's what we want to address this morning. When we turn to Exodus chapter 1, I don't think there's an English Bible translation, one that has the first word of Exodus as being and. But when you look at the original Hebrew text, the first word in Hebrew is and. So what that tells us is, what's happening is, the writer of Exodus is continuing the story that he just finished in Genesis. In Genesis, the last chapter, we have seen that Joseph has just died. Look at verse 6, chapter 1 of Exodus. Eventually, Joseph, his brothers, and everyone in his generation died. But the Israelites were fertile and became populous. They multiplied and grew dramatically, filling the whole land. Verse 8. Now a new king came to power who didn't know Joseph. This verse right here tells us a huge lesson. It's real easy to skip over this verse, but don't miss what's going on in this verse. This verse is telling us how the Israelites became enslaved. Remember how Joseph ended up in Egypt. He ended up in Egypt because his brothers sold him. He was a slave in Potiphar's house. Finally, he ended up in prison. He interprets a dream. Pharaoh has a dream, and Joseph interprets that dream. And by interpreting Pharaoh's dream about the coming famine, what happens is this: Pharaoh and Egypt survive. Because Joseph had that power, because Joseph had within him this God-given gift, the Pharaoh decided it was best to have Joseph on his side. That God would tell Joseph things that were mighty and very helpful. Well, that Pharaoh dies. Another Pharaoh comes on. Another type of king comes on. And he doesn't know that story about Joseph. All he sees is there are a bunch of Israelites among his people. He doesn't remember how if it had not been for Joseph, all of Egypt would have starved. All he sees is there is these people here. They're not like us. They don't look like us. They don't worship like us. They don't eat like us. And they're multiplying. They're multiplying. These people are a threat to my power. So what does he do? Verse 9. He said to his people, The Israelite people are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come on, let's be smart and deal with them. Otherwise, they will only grow in number. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us, and then escape from the land. As a result, the Egyptians put forward men of force. They forced work gangs over the Israelites. They harassed them with hard work. And they had them build storage cities named Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they grew and spread out, so that the Egyptians started to look at the Israelites with disgust and with dread. The Pharaoh decides, we've got to do something about these people. There's too many of them. They're too strong. They're too powerful. Let's imprison them. Now that's how they got into prison. Here's the question I want us to deal with today. Why? Why did God allow His people to be imprisoned? Why did God allow these people to go into bondage? These are God's people. God was powerful. God could have taken care of the Egyptians. Pharaoh didn't scare God. So why did God allow His people to end up in slavery? And why did God allow them to be slaves for so long? Once they got into slavery, why didn't God just rush to free them? Three things. First of all, when Israel left Egypt, they had a destination. Okay? Now, where were they going? Who can tell me where they were going when Israel left Egypt? Where were they going? They were going to the Promised Land. They were going to the land flowing with milk and honey that God had promised Abraham. Okay? I'm bound for the Promised Land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I'm bound for the Promised Land. That's where they were going. Israel at this point in time, when they first entered Egypt, couldn't take a small city over, much less a huge territory like the Promised Land. When Israel first came into Egypt, there were 75 of them. Centuries later, when they left Egypt, they were a huge nation. They were over 600,000 at that time. Just to put it in perspective, during the American Revolution, when Washington fought against England, the Revolutionary Army rarely outnumbered more than 20,000 men. World War II on D-Day, the Allied forces landed with about 156,000 soldiers at Normandy. Now that's a lot of men. But when Israel left Egypt, they had 600,000 men capable of fighting their enemy. And it was Israel's slavery. It was Israel's bondage that made them the fighting force that was needed to take Palestine. Chapter 1, verse 12, it says, the more the Israelites were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread. So not only did they grow into a huge nation during slavery, the harsh work that they were forced to do made them into a mighty people, stronger than they ever would have been. So many times people say, why do I have to go through this trial that I'm going through? So many people look at their life and they see so many things that God has allowed them to go through. And they have to say, why did God allow that? God's powerful. God didn't have to allow this to happen. Why am I going through such bondage? Why am I going through so many trials? The first reason I think God allows us to go through trials is because He wants us to become stronger. One person put it this way: without pressure, we would never have diamonds. Think about it. If there were no pressure in the earth, there would be no diamonds. And when the pressure comes on, and when the heat is turned up, that's how we know. That's how we know just how strong of a faith we have. If our faith was never tried, we would never grow in faith. Because let's be honest, if I woke up tomorrow morning and decided that I was going to get even slimmer and trimmer than I am, and I was going to get in better shape than I am, and I said, I am going to start working at it. Today, I'm going to start running. And today, before I go to bed, I am going to run 10 miles. How many of you think I could do it? Nobody? I think I could do it. I think it would hurt. I might just do it to spite you. But you know what usually has to happen before you can get slim and trim? You usually have to have some pressure. You usually have to go through some trials. I'm telling you, for me, not eating biscuits for a week is a trial. But if I want to work on my cholesterol, and I want to work on my numbers, and I want to get everything in check, you know what I've got to do? I've got to go through a time of suffering. And at the end of that suffering, you know what I will emerge as? I will emerge as a stronger, as a fitter, as a better person. Now, God's heart was breaking. And don't ever think that God sees you going through your trials and God's heart doesn't break, because it does. Some of you who have children, you know what it's like to see your children suffer. And you know what it's like to see them go through trials and to be in bondage by all kinds of things. And you know how that makes your heart break. And God feels the same way. When He sees you going through situations that are not pleasant, and when He sees you going through these bondage types of issues, it breaks His heart. Always. But He knows. He knows when the end comes, you will be able to stand, and you will be able to understand, and you will be able to emerge victorious. Sometimes that means we don't get what we want. And whoever said that the Christian life is easy, that being what God wants you to be is easy, was not telling the truth. Because the Christian life is hard. But God had a destination for these folks. Israel had a destination. It was the Promised Land. And God had told Abraham, I am giving you this land. It's going to happen. But He had to get them there. He had to get them there. They had to get to the point where they could go into the land and they could take it. And they could possess it. And for that to happen, they had to grow. They had to grow stronger. And one of the reasons God let the Israelites become slaves in Egypt was so that they could grow. The second reason that God let the Israelites become imprisoned is that He wanted to keep them out of the influence of other nations down around the land. Because you see, the Israelites were never really part of Egypt. The Egyptians were vegetarians. They despised meat eaters. And that's what the people of Israel were. Israel never fit into the Egyptian culture. In fact, when Pharaoh gave them the land of Goshen to live in, it was because the Egyptians really didn't want the land of Goshen. It wasn't very good for raising crops. It wasn't very good for grazing cattle or grazing sheep. It wasn't really good for anything. So even before they made slaves in Egypt, the people of Israel were isolated from Egyptians' culture and from the gods of Egypt and from the immorality of the Egyptians and all the other nations. So God said, even though you're going to be slaves, you're going to be in the land of Goshen. That was south, further south than any other powerful nation. What did that do? It insulated Israel from the ebb and the flow of the other cultures and the other religions. So when they emerged from slavery, they were prepared to be shaped and molded by God. They didn't worship the gods of Israel. They didn't, the gods of Egypt. They didn't live like the Egyptians. They had been set apart. And during this process, during this slavery, they began to grow. And since there were no other influences around, they began to develop tight-knit families. And they began to develop tight-knit communities. Things that they would need on the journey toward the promised land. So many times when we are in bondage, so many times when we go through trials, we miss one of the great blessings that God has for us. For you see, when you're under pressure, and when you're going through bondage, and when you're going through trials, during those times you make lasting friendships, and you make lasting relationships. And it's during those times you learn what it's like to be in the family of God. Think about some of the trials we've seen recently, and some of the things that we have witnessed people going through. And of course it's been horrible and horrific, but it's during those times that we have the opportunity to minister as a family of God. Israel had a destination. Their destination was the promised land. Before they could get there, though, before they could enter the promised land, before they were able to receive what God wanted them to have, first of all, they had to grow stronger. Second of all, they had to grow closer. And finally, I think the main reason Israel remained in slavery as long as they did was the simple reason they had never asked God to let them go free. You say, what? It's true. We've read in chapter 1 that there were a lot of Israelites. The Egyptians, well, they were mean to them. Well, chapter 1 says they multiplied. Not one verse in chapter 1 doesn't say, but they cried out to God. Not once. Finally, we get to chapter 2. And it's almost at the very end of chapter 2. Verse 23. Notice what it says. And the writer is very quick to phrase this. A long time passed, and the Egyptian king died. The Israelites were still groaning because of their hard work. The first time in the book of Exodus that we find this phrase. They cried out to be rescued from the Lord. That verse starts after a long time had passed. Oh, they've been groaning. Oh, they've been complaining. Oh, they've been saying, why me? That's what it says. They were still groaning. They were still talking about it. They had one of the world's longest pity parties. But finally, they decided to call out to God. Amazing. Why would they wait so long? Why wouldn't they cry out to God first thing? Well, because people tend to want to do things for themselves. Back in 1988, the Los Angeles Times carried the story about a 19-year-old woman. She fell asleep while driving over a bridge. Her car plunged through a guardrail. She was dangling in her car by one of its rear wheels. The rescue units and the firefighters were working hard to rescue her. But every time they'd move the car, she'd yell and she'd scream in pain. It took 2.5 hours to pull her to safety. And all through that rescue effort, all through that time, she kept repeating over and over the phrase, "I'll do it myself." The point is, apparently Israel had never gotten to the point where they bothered to ask God for help. They thought they could handle it on their own. Reminds me of a verse in James chapter 4, verse 2. You do not have because you do not ask. Until you ask, God will not intrude. You have to want His help badly enough to ask. The Israelites had been in bondage. The Israelites had been enslaved. Now, true, they needed to get powerful so they could take over the land. Yes. They needed to grow. They needed to grow closer. But they fought a battle so long by themselves that they didn't have to fight because they simply didn't ask God for help. It's so easy when we go through trials and when we go through bondage and when we go through slavery. And maybe it's slavery to overeating. Or maybe it's slavery to prescription drugs. Maybe it's slavery to internet pornography. Maybe it's slavery to smoking. It could be a number of things. You have to get to the point where you say, God, I can't do this. I can't do this. Verse number 23 of Exodus chapter 2 says, it had been a long time. It had been a long time. They had groaned, they had whined, they had cried, they had done everything. Finally, they called on God. The next verse says, God heard their cry. God remembered their covenant. Verse 25, God looked at the Israelites and God understood. He had been waiting. He had been hoping. He had been longing to intervene. Why did it take him so long? Maybe the better question is, why is it taking us so long? Why is it taking us so long? Are you weary? Are you heavy-hearted? Well, you've got a choice. Complain. Or tell it to Jesus. Are you facing fears in your life? You've got a choice. Complain. Or tell it to Jesus. Stay in bondage and enjoy your pity party, or cry out to God and see deliverance come. I don't know why it took the Israelites so long. I hope it doesn't take us that long. Freedom can come. Will we ask?